All right. John Haskell, are you in the room?
I am. How are you, Jared?
Hey, I'm good. I'm good. John Haskell with Ranch Right. That's why I couldn't find you. You're under Ranch Right. Okay, we are going to
I'm in
make
the
you
wrong
co-host.
alphabet. Very good.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. Well, hey, John Haskell and his company Ranch Right are doing some awesome things in the regenerative agriculture and agriculture at large community. Um, those principles that we talked about measuring profit, those things, his company builds out everything that you need to be able to support that. Like that's what's going to be cool. And so we're honored to have you here, John.
Well, thanks for having me, Jared. I appreciate it. I have not been able to catch much today, but I caught the last 15 minutes or so. Sounded great. And I was glad to
Hey,
see Joe Lanier on there, possibly one of the nicest people on the face of the planet there.
yeah, yep. He's a good man, good family.
Yeah, really good stuff. All
So
right, well,
yeah,
let's jump
you
in.
are.
I'm gonna share my screen, and I hope give me just a second because all
Yep,
right, awesome,
yep.
good. All right, I'll try to be well behaved with my mouse. Looks like you got good attendance. If I have to go back and forth a few times, I hope you'll excuse me. So awesome.
Not a
All right.
problem.
Well, glad you guys are all here. Glad you guys are sort of interested in taking this journey. One of the things that when we talked earlier, and one of the things we spend a lot of time now talking about on our team is when we work with people, and we primarily do, we work in the financial realm, so that's where a lot of our focus is. But what does it take to build a business that is worth passing on? And we're going to talk about a bit of a variety of things, but I am going to be fairly focused on financials today, but I'm going to touch on some other things just to make sure we have some context. And anybody that wants to jump in or ask questions, I believe I have some extra time built in. And I know we're on a fairly strict time schedule, but please, if there's something I'm, rolling through that you don't get, please feel free to interrupt me. And you can do that in Jared, I assume you were watching the chat. It sounded like maybe Selena was doing that or
Yeah, I'll
something.
I'll help out now that I'm not presenting, so I can interject if there's any clarification that we need.
Perfect. All right. Sounds really good. We've all seen those situations where we get the one day this is all going to be yours speech, and the best you can muster is, man, thanks. That's I'm not exactly sure what we've gotten our hands on here, but transitions and succession happen in a lot of different ways. And they're not always good. And that's one of the things I want to refresh us a little on. And some of this might sound a little negative today. I don't want it to feel too much that way, but I want to be real aware of when we are building a business and when we are passing a business, what we are creating. The first thing more than anything is I want most of us to recognize, especially if we are the builder of the business, that we are often building our dream. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the dream of whoever is going to come after us. And there has to be a little bit of discussion as that happens. Sometimes those dreams and aspirations are very similar between, either generations or management, teams, et cetera. But other times those are different, and we often need to be cognizant of the fact that there can be difference. The other thing I really want to think about is what type of business is successful across multiple generations. If we look across the broader world of business, there are businesses that do last through time, and they sort of have a type to them, and we want to think a little about that. One thing that is important to mention, if you look through particularly big business, so take something like the S&P 500, you may be prone to assume that those companies are big and have been there for a long time. My professional life, as an example, has shown huge turnover in that. And one of the things that alerts us to is the fact that there is a lot of turnover in business. And by that, I mean the types of businesses that rise to the top. Many of the companies that are in the top echelons of something like the S&P 500, they did not exist when I was born. They weren't even, sort of a known concern to the wider world, even when I was, graduating from high school. So when we think about, companies like Google and Meta and Amazon and all those, like those are companies that were born during most of our lifetimes and have come to dominate. And it would be a real mistake to think that a company that like GE, for example, that is very successful at one point in history is going to continue being that way forever. That is just not the way it normally works. And so when we think about the long term, we want to think about resiliency. We want to think about what are those characteristics that last through generations, not just a particular point in time. And more than anything, I really wanted people to think about why is this important? And this is going to come up multiple ways. We'll kind of talk about some of the details, but why would we want to build a business that lasts for generations? I talk with people on a fairly regular basis who have no kids and still want to build a business that they can pass off to someone else. Most of the time, we are doing it within a family context, but that is not always the case. Sometimes it's simply a professional aspiration to build something that really lasts. The first question I always want to know is, are we passing on an albatross? And the characteristics of an albatross type business are not that good. We've all seen them. We all know what they are, right? They often carry a lot of debt. They often have, either poor cash flow, no cash flow, low cash flow, something like that. We see family businesses especially, but it's true also in non-family businesses where the interpersonal relationships are terrible. We have a business that is devoid of recipes, where there isn't a plan, right? There aren't repeatable processes. And most of these businesses are characterized by huge amounts of work that don't automatically or easily translate or translate into some sort of productivity or some sort of satisfaction. Most of us are willing to work, raised with good work ethics, like to work hard, really even enjoy that. But it's so much more enjoyable and so much more sustainable if we are producing a product that we are proud of. And that could a product or an experience, producing an outcome, if you will, that we are proud of. One of the other highlights or hallmarks of an albatross business, in my mind, is a place where identity is inseparable from occupation. This is a little deeper topic that I'm not going to go into very much today, but we all know that situation where, the ranch is our life. The farm is our life, and we can't really distinguish between the farm and our family. There are certainly very valuable parts of that, but there are some places where that's a real disadvantage and can create a lot of lack of clarity. And I think when we look at our professional life in particular, the most valuable thing we can waste in is our time. And I really take this seriously at the age I am now. Jared and I have known each other now for how long? 20-ish, 20 plus years.
Yeah, at least. Yeah.
Time sort of passes. I have a few gray hairs in my beard. Many of my friends have lost a lot of hair. It seems like I look at these people and think, who are these old people that I'm suddenly surrounded with? And as I get to this age in my life, I realize that I can buy other people's time and I can buy a lot of stuff, but I can't buy a minute more of my own time. And that if I am going to work at something and I'm going to work at passing it to the next generation, I have to be pretty focused on making sure that that happens properly. All right. When we talk about creating value in a business, I'm going to approach this from a few different perspectives, but I want to talk about purpose and I want to talk about means. So this is the why and the how of a business that creates value. We all are familiar with having a purpose, right? Simon Sinek wrote a great book called "What Is Your Why?" It's a wonderful exploration of that topic. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. But at some level, there's lots of different language depending on who you work with on this. But at some point, we need a real statement of purpose for the business. And that statement of purpose has a very galvanizing effect on people that work in the business. We keep hearing over and over again about young people that are, sort of underperforming or dissatisfied in their professional life. Most of the time, what we see in those cases is a lack of purpose. When we engage particularly young people in a cause, what we find is that we get much more than their backs, right? We get their heart and their mind with it. That's how we garner the best type of participation from people. And most of the time, that's what we're looking for. I don't just want people to show up and work. I want them to contribute their ideas, their energy, their passion. I want to get sounds terrible, but I want to get all of that out of them. And I say that in some ways, not meaning it, but quite selfishly, right? If I spend time with someone, like I don't want it to just be a surface interaction. I want it to be a I want it to be meaningful. I want it to be deep for both of us. I want it to, sort of go beyond just the surface expectations. And that leads to this idea of, well, what are some of the purposes for a business? Well, there are many, and I give a few examples here, not as any sort of complete list, but without a doubt, making money in a business is absolutely required, right? I think most of us are familiar with this concept that, cash flow is like oxygen. If your business is not making money, it is probably not performing at its best, and it's probably not providing value to as many people as it could, or it is not producing value. Producing value, in my mind, is the critical part. That's what business has to do. And it does that for customers, it does it for employees, it does it for owners. We hear a little bit about stakeholder capitalism. I'm not really into that, but recognizing that a business serves multiple people and certainly does not exist just to produce a profit. But profit is an important part of what it needs to do along the way. I mentioned earlier that we need to make sure there is some room for change between generations. My grandfather and I live in a very different world. And while we may share a purpose in the most broad sense, we also have to when we get into the nitty gritty of that, we want to make sure we leave some room for each sort of successive management team or group or member to put their own stamp on the business. I hate to see companies that whipsaw back and forth between, wildly divergent things. But assuming we're within, we have some sort of range of possibilities established, then within that, we can each customize that to our personal tastes and preferences. And that really helps, again, with successive management generations, if you will, really owning the business, owning the outcome of the business. Okay, then so that relates, those things relate to the why of, creating a business and how a business creates value. But then there is the means, or the how. So what does a business have to do or have or be in order to create value? And the first most important thing when we talk long term, we need to figure out, how is success repeatable? So defining success obviously would be an important part of that process. But then what makes a company successful over and over again? We're all familiar with multi-generational ranches. They get 3 or 4 generations in and then either fail or begin to fail, or, various states of not quite doing it. And then we know other businesses that don't do that. We know other businesses that really are able to hold together for many generations and perform at a very high level. And those businesses are exceptional. I think that is not the majority, particularly in family businesses, but in any business, that is not the most common situation. And one of the things we have to recognize is that all of us, and again, I'm hearkening a little to my still young but advancing age, of the fact that at some point there's one way out of this deal. I know what my future in this company looks like if I go out far enough. We all know what that looks like on the ranch. Eventually, your grandpa is not going to be there to continue it. And if you are someone's grandpa, then that time for you is closer than it is if you're just somebody's dad. We see situations all the time where there's the terrible unexpected tragedies, and those are sort of present their own line of problems and challenges. But most of the time we see cases where we have, a septuagenarian who is still firmly in control of every process, and really we're not building a business for follow-on generations to come in. Good businesses, in my mind, are comprised of a number of important parts. And we often hear people talk about profitability and they say, oh, I run this like a business, so it has to be profitable. Like, I have a different definition of that. If something in my mind runs like a good business, it means not only does it have its financial act together, but it has a number of these other capitals, if you will, together. So there certainly is financial capital. There's organizational capital, human or social capital, and then intellectual capital. And all of these, developing these as a sort of suite of things within a business, are all the things that make a business thrive in the short term and often make it thrive for the long term. And with respect to that first bullet point, each of these contributes to repeatability. Okay, so good organizational capital is, I like to describe it as the stuff left in the business when the people have all left. So I may have a grazing plan. Well, if I'm not here today, my team can go reference that grazing plan and get cows to the right place, right? I may have a budget. When I'm not in the room, there's Somebody can handle the budget. We just had the experience of being evacuated from our house for a week due to a wildfire in our neighborhood. And it was a really good opportunity in our company to see how things would continue to function, because we literally we had kind of had a rough, vague idea we might need to leave, but I took my kids to school and was not allowed back to the house. So I really was unprepared to be gone for a week. And I had my cell phone. We did have like a 3-day suitcase in the back of the car because, again, it had been a topic of conversation. But we thoroughly thought we were going to come back to the house and then evacuate later. So as an example, that's one of those things. What are the little stress events that we can use that help us understand, do we have a good organizational capital in place? Do we have good human capital in place? Intellectual capital is things like trademarks, copyrights, those sorts of things. And then, as I mentioned, budgets, grazing plans, those things fit in the organizational capital. Organizational capital is something that, and all of these capitals allow us to build a bridge between what our goals and aspirations say we want to do and what actually happens in the day-to-day. I had the opportunity to speak with business owners on a regular basis, and they roll out this mission and vision and stuff they poured a tremendous amount of time into, and it's fantastic. And then say, well, what are you doing today? Well, we're doing da 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 da. Well, how does that relate to this? Like, well, I don't know, but the cows are out, so we got to go deal with that. Like, okay, we're trying to build a system so that our daily activities, sort of sum to a larger purpose. And again, just like with our vision, not all of these things are locked down forever. None of them are really permanent. Our organizational capital documents, as an example, we consider always a draft. We are constantly modifying them. But as you can imagine, they have kind of a boilerplate part that is 80% of the document is well structured. We make tweaks depending on, things we decide as we improve processes or as we decide a better way forward. More than anything, we have patterns in our business, and those patterns lead us to success. A few of the obstacles to creating good businesses, to building the architecture, if you will, of a good business. One of them is just being bad at business, or having a bad business. So if our customer is not doing a good job of serving customers, of creating value for customers, that's a real problem. Sometimes our successors are incompetent, and I think when we are the preceding generation, sometimes we have to think about whose fault that is. Sometimes we have, fear as a problem. Sometimes the business hasn't really created any financial capital to build itself some buffer. And sometimes it's just flat out short-term greed. We keep doing the stuff daily that we need to do without a view to the long term. This is a far from incomplete list. I bring this up only because I want to go in my next example with an opportunity for all of us to consider buying a business. And the fun thing about this is when I look at this list here, if these are obstacles to creating value in a business that is then able to survive for generations, it's not rocket science. Like the opposite often works, right? So we don't have to get too complicated about this, but if we look at these two businesses for sale, and we have our business number one is what I would consider, a more typical farm ranch business, right? Really no repeat customers, just kind of, customers are a bit random. We don't have any or much profit. We have a lot of debt relative to our cash flow. The business might require outside input of cash, or might require somebody to have another job to sort of support the family. Every day is a new day type plan. I call this the goose plan. So you wake up as though you have no idea what happened the day before and no idea what's going to happen the next day, and just deal with what's right in front of you. Just like a goose wakes up, and then you don't have any long-term employees or any competent employees that have been around more than 9 months. The way we train people is we just chuck them in the deep end, and they either sink or they swim. Almost all of them sink. We're usually disappointed with them. It's hard to find good help. Business number two is a different business, and I am not suggesting any of these as recommendations, so please don't take it as that. It's just sort of examples. Let's say I have a whole fleet of recurring subscription customers. So these people pay us on a monthly basis, and their payment is automatically ACH'd from their account every month. Those customers, have a high, what we call net promoter score, meaning they tell their friends and their family. We get lots of good personal referrals from customers. This business has a 40% profit margin. This has debt payments. Although it does have debt, the debt payments are less than half of the annual net income. And that's net, not gross. So net income, not revenue. There's an annual operating plan, and there's a long-term team that is in place that includes both a management succession plan, a detailed training process, and an onboarding process for new employees. We have annual reviews in place to help, and an employee development program that helps with continuing ed and that sort of thing. And employees are part of a profit share program. There are a lot of you here. I think I've made this point brutally. Does anybody want business number one to buy? You may, if the discount, I guess, is severe enough. Price always matters. But if we look at which business is going to be more valuable here, it's fairly obvious that this business number two is going to be a lot better. So the question is, why do those of us that own businesses not own a business like business number two? Why do we own business number one? Again, it's not rocket science. It's not like we probably need to learn some things, right? There are definitely some things to add, but the contrast is quite stark. And I'm sure all of us can think of business number one examples that are there and have been there. Maybe even they're on their third or fourth generation of being there. When we talk about building a business to pass on to someone, business number one is really not that great of a gift. Business number one is probably not one somebody would pay us for. When we are leaving it to our family, we're not leaving them much of a legacy. Now we're leaving them a wonderful challenge, and I like to challenge my children. So maybe that's what we're trying to do. If you have teenagers and a dairy cow, you're not trying to leave them a good, successful, easy business. You're trying to get them out of the house so they'll go do work. It's a very different thing. If I want my family to persist in this business and for this to be sustainable, though, I want to build a business like business number two. All right, so there are a few main ingredients here that I also want to touch on that I'm not going to spend a ton of time on. Some I will. First off, in this process, we have to think specifically about the transition. I think most people make this far too difficult. Mostly because people don't get along or there's a presumption of not getting along. I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but when we are talking about, and this is within families and with other types, even businesses that are not family, right? We need to have a plan for transition. I am not going to be the owner and the chief operator forever. We need to have a structure, we need to have people in place, and we need to have development. We need to be able to build people to work their way up the ladder or recruit people in from outside who can fill in those places. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, but again, we need a strong financial portion or segment of the business. Positive cash flow is something that always helps, right? Very few people go broke in a business that produces a lot of cash. Retained earnings are a very important part of a long-term business strategy because that is where compound growth comes from within a business. Tax management is something that applies both to the transition period and the ongoing operation of the business. And I have totally misspelled manageable debt, and I apologize for that. But debt, there's nothing inherently wrong with debt in a multi-generational business, but it has to be manageable. We can reduce risk in our business by getting rid of, and maybe some debt, maybe all debt. That isn't necessarily required. If the debt is manageable relative to the cash flow, that can be a very good business to sustain over time. The other thing, we talk about this in sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture all the time about leaving residual in our pastures. We rarely leave financial residuals for a rainy day. And imagine a transition period from father to son, grandfather to grandson that doesn't go perfectly. Like that's something we should plan for. Like whenever a new manager comes in, I think about this all the time. Anytime we have a new employee, he's always the one that breaks the most stuff. If it's a female, she usually breaks less stuff, but when we hire a new male cowboy, invariably he's going to break something fairly significant the first 6 months of his tenure. We plan for that. We have a budget for that. And when we talk about, I think of this as excess capacity, and I really want to make sure we're thinking of it not just as financial. We also don't want our people burned to the end so that if something goes wrong, now the crisis is happening on top of an overcommitted schedule. We want to have some room. We want to have reserve in all aspects of our business. There are a few things here. Preparation for an emergency or unexpected event. I have a very good friend who is a year older than I am. He also has three young children. Had a stroke. Is probably going to be down for a year. It has put his family, as you can imagine, and he's got kids that are 4 and 2. Put his family in a tough spot. Not only are they enduring a lot of expenses that go with his care and treatment and all that, but he is not able to contribute anything positively to the bottom line other than a somewhat slurred, good job, guys. And that's a very difficult position for most of us to think about, but it is more common than you think. One thing I want to mention here, I see a lot of people that talk a lot about, well, we do handshake deals. I have learned over, especially the last 10 years, I do handshake deals, but we also have a contract. And the reason is if one of us that is shaking hands is not here in the future, the other of us is probably dealing with a spouse or a child. And contracts are not necessarily for the two of us that shake hands. They're for the people that might have to clean up what we did while we were shaking hands. All right, the last thing I want to cover quickly today is a quick model of financials. This comes from Robert Kiyosaki's series of books, Cash Flow Quadrant, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. You may have heard about it. And I want to break our financials into a couple of important pieces. We have a profit and loss, which deals with income and expenses, right? Revenue comes in here, expenses go out, right? So this is gas and feed and all that kind of stuff. This is sale of livestock and crops. And then we have a balance sheet, which is our assets and liabilities. This might include pickup trucks and cows and real estate. And this, of course, is debt right here. There are a lot of ways to structure a business that the way these categories interact becomes very important. And I'm just going to show you a few quick examples. I can have a set of financials for myself personally, let's say, where I generate an income and I pay expenses and I use the excess that is left over from that to pay liabilities. So this is, I go to work, I feed my family, I pay my mortgage. Okay. That's one model of financials. Another is I go to work, I feed my family, I buy vending machines that I put in the local gas station, which then provide additional income back to my family. I can go out and secure debt, which then I use to buy a herd of cows, right? And if I'm doing things correctly, hopefully that herd of cows provides income back to our family, which then pays our expenses. And most of the time we work in businesses and in personal situations with arrows going everywhere. The worst case, I'm going to scroll back here real quickly. The worst case in the world, I think, Kiyosaki spends a lot of time talking about this, is this example, right? Money comes in and then it just goes out and goes away. What we are trying to do in our family and in our business is recycle this money as much as possible. I'm trying to wear these dollars out before they ever leave our grasp, okay? We have assets which generate income that pay our expenses and allow us to buy more assets. We also, from that income, can secure more liabilities, which allow us to get more assets. And the idea that we are trying to wear a dollar out in this circle is really where we want to get to. The reason I bring up this model and why this model is important, when we look at multi-generational businesses, we better be living in this area here where assets are what is driving it. This
Oh, hey,
first
John,
yeah.
this half hour snuck up on us super quick. I just looked at the clock and
Okay.
we only have like a minute left.
I think this is my last slide.
Hey, you're right on.
Last. Okay. I got two I can skip. So anyway, this is work. Okay. A person has to keep doing this. If you're going to pass this to the next generation, so not so great. A little hard to sustain if the next generation doesn't work. This model has a very high probability of succeeding into the next generation, in part because the primary reliance is on assets. There is some work involved, but assets are an important part of the picture. And that's
Love it.
what I summarized there. I want to give you a quick picture and then I'll go. These are businesses that manage retained earnings differently. This is dollars on the left and about a 24-year period on the right. We deal with situations between the combination of profit margin and how much the owners take out of the business go very different directions. I apologize, Jared. That did go quickly.
That was
Happy
super
to
quick.
take
Okay.
questions. If you guys want to email me, you're more than welcome to. This is our
Yeah.
company
And
website. Yeah, good.
if you want to stick around in the chat, sometimes people, if you want to just respond to questions in the chat, because we're
You
short on
bet.
time, you can
I
look for
can do that.
that. So if anybody
Okay.
has questions, throw them in there. Throw up your insights as we've been doing. Teach back to this group, 1, 2, 3 things that you've taken away from John's presentation. Um, what is your offer, John? Tell us about that, and we'll roll into
So
Jimmy.
the biggest thing we have now is through our website, ranching.fyi. You can get on there. We have a series of forums on there that discuss different topics within the world of ag. And we have a number of experts that moderate those forums. And I would encourage you to get on there. If you have questions, throw them in there. Find a forum that works. Get on there and ask questions. That's an opportunity for you to ask questions and maybe answer some for somebody else. But those discussions get pretty exciting at times. So jump in there, and that's a resource that, um, like I say, you can solve real problems there.
Love it. Love it. Very good. Very good. So yeah, take
Thanks, Sharon. I
definitely
appreciate the opportunity.